Under Salah al-Din's leadership, our opposition has been put to the sword, and the ghost in the feed has been traced. This, unfortunately, is the totality of good news I can commit to this record. Our next destination involves a raid on a highly secured research facility. Should the records of this operation ever be unsealed, military scholars will no doubt note the great irony, having gathered allies from the Kapukkalki and Hakislam's military task forces, that it should once again be the Hassassin Bahram and the Hassassin Bahram alone capable of fighting under this engagement's conditions. Never, in all my years of humble service, have I encountered deployment conditions so dire as those necessitated by this raid. Aerial support from the Kapukkalki will see us in, but the facility's entrance points and local communications baffling will place our teams at extreme risk. Our sole consolation is that any forces deployed by our adversary will operate under equally extreme conditions. Given her involvement in both preceding operations, Operative Sharif has formally requested permission to see this matter out. She need not have asked. The troops have already come to see her as something of a good omen, and while I should by all rights place myself above such superstitions, this old man finds himself in complete agreement. Our transports are inbound to the facility. I can only pray for her success. Yes, today we're playing episode 3 of the Ruby Monday campaign, Black Box. And I wasn't kidding in that intro spiel when I said that this is perhaps the most extreme deployment conditions I have ever seen in any scenario I have ever played in Infinity. In fact, if this mission was an ITS scenario played at an event, it would probably just wipe half of all factions out of contention to even play, and make most of the rest of the factions in the entire game demand a list dedicated to just this scenario. Now, that sounds pretty extreme, but this is a narrative scenario. We're not playing this as part of an ITS, and so I got to pick a faction and write a list just for this scenario. But my plan to approach the Ruby Monday campaign, playing ideally all of the Hackislam factions, hoping to get a QK and Rama Task Force game in, were knocked out of the water when I read this mission. There are only a very small number of factions that could do the lists that I think would be needed for this scenario, and Hassassin Bahram are actually one of them, so back to the Hassassins we go. And alright, what is it that makes this scenario so difficult? To begin with, let's just talk about the deployment conditions, because the actual scenario is not enormously complicated. To start with, it's power pack deployment. Now, we will come back around to that because it's going to significantly inform my strategy for this mission. But power pack deployment, just to begin with, that is a difficult deployment condition. That alone would necessitate thinking a lot about how your list wants to play in the scenario, but there are two further restrictions that really go above and beyond. The first is a rule that doesn't particularly have a name, but which for this purpose we'll call a total exclusion zone. No special deployment skills can be used in this mission. Every model must deploy inside one of those two deployment zones that you have access to, and that includes models that you are hoping to have use parachutist or infiltration or impersonation. Secondly, each one of those two deployment zones that you have must have all of a combat group in it. You cannot split combat groups across the two deployment zones, which is thematically very interesting, right? Like, you have two different strike teams that are moving on each of these two objectives, but it means that your list has to accommodate a plan from list construction as to how you're going to make that work. Both of the lists that we'll see in this game have made heavy use of tactical awareness orders to bulk out combat group order pools so that combat groups can be split kind of evenly across the two deployment zones. Now, once you're actually deployed, the mission plays fairly cleanly. There are two objectives. The first is the security office, which has two consoles in it. Each can be used once to do one of two things. Firstly, it can remove locks and protections on the research lab. You don't have to do that, and in fact, my plan would be to not do that. And we'll get to why as we move through the game. But the other thing, which is worth 2 objective points, is to use one of the two consoles in the security office to erase the evidence of your involvement in the mission. Nice little narrative flair, that's worth 2 of the 10 objective points you can score, and if you can stop your opponent from doing it, that's worth another 2. If you're a hacker, and a hacker alone, you get the specialist bonus, so +3 willpower, +1 special die, to activate things in the security office. So, okay. If I'm deploying on the B side of the diagram there, then I want my strike team in DZB2 to have a hacker in it that can press those buttons. In the research lab, there is just a single research console. You'll note that there are 4 armed turrets, but they only actually appear if you try and activate the research console without having first pressed a button in the security office to give yourself access. If you haven't pressed that button in the security office, then you have a -6 roll to open up the research lab, and you will trigger the turrets. And there are 4 turrets with +1 burst, total reaction, adhesive launcher rifles. Regardless of whether or not you've got access or not, if you access the research lab, you will pull the research out of the research lab console, and once you've got it, you are carrying it. There are only ever 1 of those in the game, and there are 4 points on the line for controlling that at the end of the game, plus 2 points for having it gotten back to one of your deployment zones. So 6 points in total for getting the research, which means effectively the player who gets the research and gets it back to one of their deployment zones will win the game. The first player has the first crack at that. The second player has the last chance to go in after the model holding the research data and kill it and seize it for themselves. Now, notwithstanding that potential small advantage to the second player, my plan, if I won the lieutenant role in this scenario, was 100% to go first, and the reason why is that this is a power pack deployment zone mission, and very bluntly, power pack deployment zones fucking suck. They are awful, and I can prove that with math. Well, math and fixing the definitions, but bear with me. If we evaluate the usefulness of a deployment zone, and I'm going to go through this a little bit because this has been on my mind, but I do think it's actually really useful as a little bit of theory to thinking about how you use deployment zones in a scenario and the utility that a deployment zone gives you. The table is often called the third player in a game of Infinity, and the deployment zone is that part of the table that is immediately accessible to you. And so, noting that we can't assess the terrain until we get to the table, looking just at the scenario, there are 2 things that make a deployment zone valuable to a player, especially from a defensive perspective, right? So if we evaluate the quality of a deployment zone in terms especially of its defensive utility to us, there are 2 things that we are looking for. The first is just amount of space in which to deploy. The larger a deployment zone is physically, the more likely it is to have terrain and defensive positions and just general things that are useful to us to deploy safely and establish a defense. And of every scenario Infinity has ever had in its entire existence, Power Pack has the least space available to any player. Now, strictly speaking, there is an identical amount of area to Biotech 4, and if you've played Biotech 4, you will immediately get chills that I'm making that comparison. But strictly speaking, you have slightly less accessible space in Power Pack, just because of the function of how a square thing cannot fit perfectly into a corner, and Power Pack deployments have more corners than Biotech 4 zones do. So Power Pack, by a very small margin, has the least space to deploy your troops of any scenario that has ever been played in Infinity, but for functional purposes, it's basically identical to Biotech 4. Why then do I think that Power Pack is worse for a deployment from a defensive perspective than Biotech 4? Because the second thing that we're looking for in deployment zones isn't just space, it's depth. Now, defense in depth is a military concept, and you can absolutely apply it to Infinity, but in the simplest sense, depth indicates the ability to have distance from your opponent. The further you are from your opponent, the harder it is for them to reach you, because every inch of ground they cover costs them some of that critical resource that they're using to attack, their order pool. And that's why, even though the actual area available to a radial deployment scenario often feels it's less than a regular 12-inch deployment zone, radial deployments actually can allow for really quite good defense because they have such significant depth. Often a player will have 1 or 2 models that it's quite important to protect, your lieutenant if nothing else in some cases. And a radial deployment scenario, even though the closest points, the tips of radial deployments, are closer together than they are in Power Pack, a radial deployment itself offers 24 inches of depth to play with, which is one of the reasons why radial deployments are really interesting and compelling, that is, as an alternative to usual square deployments that have emerged in N5. By comparison, In Power Pack, there's only 16 inches between the two deployment zones, and therefore the absolute maximum distance that can be between you and your opponent is a bit less than 32 inches. And that presupposes you're hugging the back table edge, which you're not. You're going to have to deploy pieces throughout those deployment zones because they are so tightly constrained, which means that in Power Pack you have very little depth to play with, in addition to having very little space to play with, which means, in short, in Power Pack, going second, you're a sitting duck. Power Pack deployments were already kind of difficult to play as second player in Infinity back when they existed in N3, and that is before the entry into the game of so many things that really would never have been tolerated in old Power Pack. Flyers, higher quality rapid offensive units, and even just pieces like the Katyusha, the Tractor Mule Courier in particular. Anyone in the audience who has played against Tractor Mule Couriers, I want you to imagine going second against Tartary Army Corps with a Tractor Mule Courier nestled on top of the building at the front of each of the two opposing DZs. That is to say, you have most of your army inside effective range of those couriers from the first order of the game. You could just lose the game to spec fire, and let's just leave it at that as a little bit of a foreshadowing as to how the game is going to go in our place. In short, though, I'm going to be trying to go first because I think first player has it all their own way in this scenario. Not just because of the deployment zones, but also because of a couple of other things in the scenario that we'll get to as we play. So, lists first. And as noted, I'm playing Hassassin Bahram. One of the really interesting things about Hassassin Bahram, and the reason that I reached for them in this scenario, is that even though in N5 we kind of think of them as an ambush faction with infiltrating and forward deployment and hidden deployment and of course impersonation, although frankly people aren't using Fidays terribly much these days, you can actually run a Hassassin Bahram list that is completely deployment zone bound with very high quality pieces. Probably more so than either Kapukaki or Vanilla Hack Islam, certainly in Power Pack constricted deployment, or Rama Task Force, and so I reached for Hassassin Bahram in this list to play a version of an old list archetype called Arabian Nights, and it works by just running really good quality heavy infantry because Asawira are really good quality heavy infantry. And one of the things that particularly differentiates this list from the list that we played in the first scenario in the Ruby Monday campaign is that I don't have to take two Hassassin Bokdars, and I'm also not taking any impersonation models or infiltration models, which means I can really go all in on Asawira, which means I can go all in on access to Disco. That means I have Eclipse, that means I have freedom to maneuver, that means I get to play the game that I want, and it's something that was missing and excluded from my lists when I was relying on the Bokdars and just regular smoke to push forward. Now, because this is black box, I'm splitting my list according to how I want them to deploy, and so I've got two combat groups with both NCO and a high tactical awareness order count in order to just manage that deployment zone constriction where the first combat group will deploy across from the security center looking to assault it, and the second combat group will deploy across from the research center looking to assault it. So the first combat group consists primarily of a Fireteam Haris. It's a Ghulam Haris built around a Ghulam NCO with Layla Sharif and an Asawira. Layla Sharif is partly there for narrative reasons. She's been in both of my previous lists in the Ruby Monday campaign, but also because she's a hacker I increasingly like, as if I'm only going to take one hacker, she's a good one. She's got 6th Sense Carbonite and KHD and Firewall, and with EM Mine she can potentially help secure the security room if that's something I need to do. The Asawira is a fantastic tip of the spear. Disco is really, really useful, especially on a linked Ballistic Skill 14 model. And then the Ghulam NCO is there to provide smoke and an NCO order, and particularly the 24-inch range on both smoke and specfire. Specfire, I've kind of made the case for in this scenario deployment, but smoke, I was hoping to be able to support the combat group in the deployment zone opposite, potentially to enable a little bit more push there. We then have a Ghulam and a Bereed Lieutenant Forward Observer. That's just a Lieutenant and a Decoy. A Matawiya with Jammer and Fanus Remote. You'll see that each combat group has a Jammer and a Repeater able to deploy kind of relatively far up and toward the corner of the deployment zones, because those are just as far as you're going to go having passive defense in a power pack deployment zone scenario, a combination of a jammer and a repeater is about as good as you're going to get to try and stave off close assaults on your deployment. And then finally, in this combat group, we have as our reserve drop Magmara. He's just insanely dangerous in power pack. I mean, he's very good already, but he is insanely dangerous in power pack deployments because of how fragile and vulnerable they are. We will see him do plenty during the course of this game. In Group 2, we then have the group that's going to be assaulting the Research Center, and it's a big 5-person fire team with a lot of heft. It's a Boktar and 2 Hassassin Moyib heavy rocket launch tactical awareness, and then 2 Asawira, 1 boarding shotgun, 1 disco ball. The Boktar I'm frankly kind of mixed on, but it's another tactical awareness order, and frankly I had the points because I'm spending 0 points on things like Shujay or Hassassin for days. Again, lots of tactical awareness orders lets us get forward and manage the fact that we are split kind of evenly across the 2 groups. Wouldn't do that in a normal mission, but this is a narrative and we're building specifically for it, and then Camille and a Matawiya to provide that corner of the deployment zone defense. This is a list that's looking to go first and do a bunch of damage and potentially do a smash and grab. We'll see a plan that I have for that in this mission, and it needs lots of orders to do it and lots of robust stuff. The defenses in this list, yes, are a repeater and a Matawiya per deployment zone, but then also when you get to those deployment zones, what you're fighting are things like Asawiras, which especially having to attack into Asawiras can be very difficult and take a very long time. Playing against us today is my good friend Chris playing Varuna, and as noted, his plan is actually to go second and have a list that's built very well to survive going second, hence Varuna. Combat groups are split the same way. Combat group 1 in his case will be going after the research center. Note that there are a lot of paramedics there, that's just because he had the points. You do need a doctor for the specialist bonus, but he's going second, it wouldn't matter. And then in combat group 2, we have the group who's responsible for the security room. Again, it's kind of interesting having that dichotomy. I would not want to see that in an ITS scenario, but for a narrative, you can build for it, and it's kind of cool. So Combat Group 1 has a bunch of the classics, frankly so does Combat Group 2. Kamau, Paramedic Tactical Awareness, duoed with a Knight of Montesa FTO. The Knight of Montesa is the real star here, but the Kamau can help get them both forward. Tactical Awareness on the Kamau is nice, and it's a specialist for this scenario. You've got an unlinked Knight of Montesa motorized, again another very good piece. The fact that it's a Paramedic is a little bit irrelevant in this case because it can't get into either of the objective rooms, but it's just very good for 23 points. Pathfinder drawn by Tactical Awareness, Fusilier Lieutenant, Fusilier Paramedic, Kamau MSV2, and an Echo Bravo. The Echo Bravo is interesting here because you would think a drop troop is very bad in this scenario, and certainly it has limitations, but Chris has a very specific plan. The Echo Bravo will be deploying at some point during the game as reinforcement to whichever of the 2 zones is needed, and to do that he's going to actually change its combat group around based on where it needs to go. As it happens, he will deploy it in the deployment zone associated with the group that it's in, but if he'd needed it to go and reinforce Patsy Garnett in Group 2 and her team, he would have just switched its combat group before it deployed. In Combat Group 2, then, we have Patsy Garnett linked with 2 Heelot FTOs, both submachine gun and light rocket launcher, a Heelot with shock marksman rifle, a Zulu Cobra mine layer X-Visor multi-marksman EM mine assault pistol. I love this profile, just by the by. I don't know when it was added to Varuna, but I'm sure relatively recently, and it's just the kind of platonic ideal of a defensive and offensive piece. It's Ballistic Skill 13 with a multi-marksman, it's Mimetism and Surprise Attack, it's a Mine Layer with EM mines, and if it has to fight at close range, it's got an assault pistol. I love models with assault pistols as sidearms, they're such a nice gun, and all of this for 26 points is really solid. It is using that mine to help provide a bit of fuzz in the info space around what other camouflage markers there might be, because we have another camouflage marker, Zulu Cobra KHD. The Zulu Cobra's job is absolutely to get into the deployment zone, or the security room and do the things that need to be done there. We then also have a Pathfinder Tactical Awareness in this group for lots of total tactical awareness orders, the same count as me actually. Both of these lists are 19 order lists. And while the Pathfinders can't physically enter the objective rooms, they can absolutely sweep the objective rooms of things like mines, etc., to enable other pieces to do so. So just solid enabling pieces. It's kind of funny. I love the fact that a tactical awareness forward observer remote, even when it physically can't do the objective, is still just extremely useful. So the plan of this list is to go second. It's to go second behind just top shelf Varuna defenses, 2 linked helots, an unlinked helot, a Kamau, a Montesa paramedic, like just top shelf ARO pieces, and just go, you can't fight through all of this. We will hold. We even have a mine layer, and then when we have finished holding, we will go and do the mission, and we will go after the model that's holding the research. You're the first player who has to actually break into the rooms, spend all of your orders, and so that's the plan that this list has for managing the risks posed by the extreme deployment conditions of this scenario. So we would mid-lieutenant roll, Chris would win the LT roll, and he would elect to deploy second on the right side of the table. I would snap pick going first, and we would deploy as follows. So this is the research room here, and this is where I'm going to be assaulting with the team with the doctor in it. On this rooftop up here, we can see the Camille baggage bot and the Ghazi Matawiya, and then spread out in this position here are the assault team. So that's Asawira, Bokta, and 2 Hassassin Moyibs. I'm able to scope out the deployment zones, and because there is zero potential for any infiltration or anything, I know with 100% certainty all of the positions I can be watched from, and so I just deploy in a position where I know that I'm completely safe behind the objective room. With the objective rooms, we are playing them as kind of like classic buildings, which at least locally are see into or out of but not through, but I will note that the doors to this objective room are very low, and so high ground has difficulty seeing into it in any case. On this side of the table over here, kind of the same deal, we have a Ghazi Matawiya able to just impetuous up and forward, looking to do the same thing as the other Ghazi Matawiya, establish that buffer zone with the jammer, and then the repeater, the Fanus remote, is on this rooftop. There is a Ghulam kind of pretending to be a lieutenant, and a Hassassin Barid kind of pretending to be a lieutenant, and then McMurray will be my reserve drop, and the fire team otherwise will all be deployed around here. That's the Asawira, the Ghulam grenade launcher, and Layla Sharif. For Chris's part, he establishes a pretty hard ARO presence. So the Montesa paramedic is deployed over here, the Pathfinder is hanging out in the back, and then we have a variety of Fusiliers and Kamau stuff. The Kamau Takaware is behind this billboard here, but the paramedic FTO with its 3 dice in ARO is deployed on this rooftop. Very difficult to reach. It's got very slightly awkward AROs in the sense that firing down into the objective room is going to be just slightly outside of good range, but it's going to have a decent line down here and a decent line into the objective room. And the thing about Montesa Knights is that they roll so many dice and they're so durable to kill that it doesn't matter. They're just there to stall your opponent up, and they might do something catastrophic. The Kamau sniper is very nicely positioned, so she can fire down into these positions down this alleyway here, but more importantly, she's actually positioned to have a really very good line into this objective room. This objective room has got, even though they're all narrow gates for rule purposes, this objective room has relatively wide visibility angles into it, and so this Kamau sniper is doing a fantastic job at long range locking down this objective room. I'm going to be able to make some cautious moves and a little bit of movement in and around, but I'm going to have to use Disco to get past her. I wouldn't be able to do that if I wasn't playing the Asawira. Over here, we've got Patsy Garnett and her 2 helots. First helot is here, second helot is here. Patsy is on the second lower level of this building. The helot marksman rifle is deployed behind this cover. It's got, reasonable lines up and around here. And then we have 3 camouflage markers, which we know are a Zulu Cobra, a mine, and then another Zulu Cobra. This one is the mine. This is the Zulu Cobra KHD, but they're both standing to look like they could be mines. I also have to respect that they might be jammers. And then this one here is the Zulu Cobra marksman rifle, able to stand up if it needs to. So those are very solid defensive positions, especially for Varuna. Especially attacking into this deployment zone here is going to be quite difficult because of the quality of the Montesa Knights, especially as defensive pieces. Chris is well defended, but this is still a power pack scenario, and the vulnerability is very difficult to play around. So, my first turn, what are we going to do? Well, McMurray and the Matawiya is going to be able to impetuous. Matawiya just impetuouses forward into safety. She'll just live there forever. McMurray, importantly, does not declare jump. He just declares move. If he'd jumped, he'd have gone too far. But by declaring move, he's going to just move up here. He's tall enough to vault onto this riser, and he's going to be able to throw a smoke grenade on the way through down to there. Because the buildings are see into or out of but not through, I know he can't enter the building. I know he's safe from the Kamau, and so as his irregular order, he's going to move around here, ask for any arrows, and when none are forthcoming, he'll nestle in behind this billboard here. And having nestled in behind this billboard here, he will proceed to throw a fuck ton of grenades. Now, it's going to take quite a bit of work, and I'm going to intersperse those grenade attacks with other things that I need to do with the orders that that combat group has. But by the end of the turn, after throwing a bunch of grenades, McMurrough has gotten into effect. This is 8 inches here to here, and so he is able to land grenades on 13s in this rooftop, and a couple of grenades later, he will put down both this Zulu Cobra and this Helot, and with spare orders at the end of the round, throwing grenades at long range, that's only a -9 for him, so he still hits on 7s. He will take out this Pathfinder as well. Just again, to reiterate, power pack deployments are terrible and vulnerable. Now, doing all of that does still take a bunch of orders from McMurrough, which you would think means, oh, well, so aren't you looking to access the security consoles? In particular, don't you need to access one of these consoles to remove the lock on the research center to stop the defenses from triggering? And my answer to that is, I have no intention of stopping those defenses from triggering. Those defenses are a massive advantage to the first player. I don't think they were meant to be. I think when this scenario was written up, the kind of idea as to how players would play it is that the first player, if they wanted to access the research room without triggering all of those defenses, well, they would need to also invest some orders in activating a console in the security zone. No, those turrets are an advantage, and I'm going to show you why. Since they're an advantage, the only thing that I need the troopers in this combat group to do will be to lay down some smoke to support the advance of the other team. But first, the other team does need to get some conditions established. They're going to be using a combination of regular and tactical awareness orders. Chris has stripped one order from each group, kind of reasonably. And this fire team is going to be moving up and around here and laying some disco. It's going to get some disco down here. It's not as good as it looks. The Kamau still has excellent lines into this deployment zone. And it's going to then get some disco down here. And then finally what we're actually sort of here. And then finally what we're going to need is for a smoke grenade. And this is going to take an annoying number of orders, even though it's in range, is we're going to get a smoke grenade from these stairs along this line here, just to there. And that's going to give us a nice space in the middle of this room where if I want to, I can always have someone inside smoke. Now, we are going to use our orders to have a crack at enemy pieces that are that are visible for us to attack here. I'm going to have the Bokdar try and fight the linked paramedic Montesa. That's going to go about as well as you would expect. It's a linked paramedic Montesa. I hit it a bunch of times, and that's all because it's a linked paramedic Montesa, and I'm using a Bokdar, and a Bokdar has a Red Fury. But if nothing else, it's tactical awareness order, and tactical awareness orders are good. I'm also going to be able to catapult the Disco Asawira out of the smoke into other smoke and around this corner into the paramedic Kamau. I will stab it all the way to death, and I will absolutely die for my troubles next turn. I am mixed on whether or not that was a good call. I suspect it probably was. Throwing away the Asawira, and I am throwing away the Asawira, is like, it's a more expensive model than the Kamau, but that Kamau represents a tactical awareness order that can be linked with the Montesa FTO. Not just that, it's a source of pure link team bonuses, and I had kind of hoped the Asawira would be difficult to kill in the subsequent turn. Spoiler alert, it would not be. End of the day, none of that is the end of the world, because I have a very specific plan here. I'd hoped to do a bunch of damage against an opponent with weaker defenses than the Varuna Immediate Reaction Division. I might have just hit this deployment zone like a thunderbolt from God and just blown it out with a pair of Asawira shotguns with 3 tactical awareness orders behind them. That didn't happen in this case. However, I was still able to accomplish my main goal, which was, with the plentiful orders remaining after all of that, the Asawira Doctor, inside smoke, attempted to activate the research console. Now, in this scenario, if you haven't used a security console to gain facility access, you have a massive -6 mod to this roll, but then you have a Doctor, which grants you a +3 mod and a special die, which means I'm rolling 2 dice on 11s, which is a very good chance to succeed in one go, excellent chance to succeed in 2. I succeed on the first try, and by attempting to access the research console without having first gained facility access, boom, 4 turrets pop up. Excellent. That is perfect for me because I am moving through smoke and I am just going to retreat backwards and end the turn, and now there are 4 turrets that are Chris's problem to deal with. I have just turned that to a massive advantage for me because I've smashed and grabbed and stolen the objective, and now there are 4 entire turrets between Chris and me in any attempt he might make to go after and get the objective. Even if he does manage to push through the turrets, there's a jammer, there's a repeater, and then it's being held by an Asawira defended by a Bokdar and 2 Hassassin Moyibs. So things are looking good, and again, as a reminder, I have blown the fuck out of this combat group over here. And this is where we see one of the second externalities in this scenario come into play. Because you are forced to entirely deploy combat groups inside deployment zones, it means that it's very easy to cripple your opponent's offensive power along one flank. At the beginning of the game, this combat group over here had two Zulu Cobras, three Helots, two of which were regular, and Patsy Garnett. That's enough to accomplish actually a fairly robust counterattack, but knocking three regular orders and a tactical awareness order out of this combat group has left it with very little gas in the tank, and so I'm just completely safe. Unless Chris spends loads of command tokens moving models that are on this side of the table into this combat group, I'm just completely fine, and he probably can't do that. Now, what he can do is kick this poor Asawira while it's down by taking an Impetuous activation with this Knight of Montesa. It'll actually run down and around here, but on the way out it will shotgun the Asawira 3 times in the back of the head. Actually, sorry, no, I tell a lie. Its Impetuous order carries it forwards, but again, it shotguns the Asawira 3 times, 2 in a special die. He hits twice because special die, and I fail both saves, and I'm very sad about that, but it is what it is. With how the Kamau that I stabbed was placed, I could never get into cover against that model. And so yep, that Asawira was always a little bit doomed to that Impetuous activation. The second Impetuous activation that gets taken is that this Knight of Montesa zooms around here. And that is definitely a risk. It's a risk because Chris knows that he is going to be exposed to those adhesive launcher turrets, but he needs to really aggressively push if he's got to have any chance of stealing that research data from me this turn. What does happen, though, is that 2 of the 4 turrets get line of sight to the Montesa Knight. They fire 6 dice of burst into him. All of them are in good range. He does attempt to face them all, is not able to do so, and he gets adhered and is stuck to the ground, basically in this position here. And with no visibility of control of his own, and you need a lot of smoke in order to be able to push your way past 4 of these turrets, Chris is left with little choice but to just try and engage the damn things. And so it's going to be this Knight of Montesa and this Pathfinder Dronbot that try and do that. The Pathfinder Dronbot is able to move out and engage this one quite well. It's engaging inside 16, it's in good range, the turret is out of cover, the Pathfinder is still just a Pathfinder, and so after tactical awareness and several regular orders, it takes quite a bit of time for the Pathfinder to put this one down, but it does, and the Montesa Knight comes out and around and attempts to engage this one over here, but it gets glued in the process of doing so. The one silver lining of this activation is that as the Montesa Knight moves out and around here, it does have the presence of mind to put more shotgun shots into the Asawira, lest it regenerate, so the Asawira does go all the way to dead, but that's basically all that is able to be accomplished. With all of those adhesive turrets to have to fight through. Even though I think Chris is able to put like 2 of them down, I think he puts this one down as well by the end of the round. It costs him immobilization on his 2 most valuable strike pieces. And yeah, so just using those turrets as my advantage as the first player paid off enormously. I am completely intact in this combat group over here, and there are now 2 thoroughly immobilized knights. Now, on the left flank, my right flank, Chris is able to get some runs on the board, and that's because the order efficiency of being so close is useful here. The deployment zones are a little bit interesting where your access to each of the 2 consoles is not symmetrical. Normally, my deployment zone is closer to this one here, but because of how the ramps are set up, it's actually a little bit easy for Chris to get to this one. So the Zulu Cobra is going to come up around here, confirm nothing can see it, it's going to activate this console, and then it's going to recamouflage. That's all it gets to do, but it does get to do that. So Chris has scored 2 points. The problem for Chris at this point is that he inflicted no casualties on me during that turn because his entire turn was spent trying to fight through those turrets that popped up to my advantage. And so I once again have a full tank of gas. Now, there are a few things that we need to do, and I will sustain some casualties here. The first is that this Ghazi Matalia, as its Impetuous activation, is going to climb. It's going to climb up to here, into line of sight of this Zulu Cobra. And Chris kind of gives me this look when this happens, and he's like, I know that you're trying to bait me, but I also know that if I don't take the bait, you'll just discover shoot me as your next order. So fine, I guess. And he takes the shot into the Ghazi Matalia, hits and puts her dogget. That's fine. She then spends her irregular order. She swings around here. He takes the shot again. I chain rifle, and he survives the chain rifle and puts the Ghazi Matalia down. So hero Zulu Cobra. However, the Ghazi Matalia has, in the process of doing all of that, revealed the Zulu Cobra, and so McMurray just peeks in the door. The Zulu Cobra fires. No, the Zulu Cobra dodges because McMurray does have 2 chain rifles, and McMurray just throws a grenade at its head. Technically not a spec fire, but chalk up yet another grenade kill for McMurrough. For those keeping score at home, that is now 4 grenade kills for McMurrough, and a 5th will join him this round. Actually, no, it's not McMurrough that will score that, but good job, McMurrough. The Zulu Cobra is down. Now, we will once again be using the Gulam NCO smoke grenade launcher to pop up onto this ramp and get some smoke down here, and we're going to be using that smoke to have this fire team over here move out. Now, they've got a couple of things to do, but relatively limited objectives. I am not fool enough to go after this Montesa Knight. It's just too difficult to get into him. He's thoroughly covered by the Kamau, and I have no more disco because the Asawira over there is dead. Instead, we're just going to use the use the Boktar to score 2 relatively clean kills. It will still take time because Red Fury. The first is that the Boktar is going to come out here to see the paramedic, the immobilized paramedic biker, and 2 rolls later we'll have the Boktar down. Then it's going to peek through this smoke here and see the Pathfinder drone bot, put it down by smoke shooting. The drone bot dodges, which means I'm hitting on 7s, but I do score a crit there, and it is a 0 armor model. And then every remaining order in that combat group, which is multiple tactical awareness and some regular orders, are going to be spent just running. In fact, we are going to run all the way down and around here, just move, 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 move. Of the 9 orders in that combat group, something like 6 of them are going to be spent making this move. And I'll even have enough orders left at the end of that to have a Moyib just peek this corner here and take a face-to-face roll against Patsy Garnett, although she will survive. For the first combat group, we've got some orders left that need to be spent, and so it's time to get a little bit more disco down in this zone. I've only spent 1 disco ball with the Asawira so far. Actually, I'm not even sure if I've spent that once. So this is the first disco we spent with the Asawira, and we're going to use that disco to enable Layla Sharif to get up and around here, activate this console, just to erase the evidence of my involvement. That's a 2 objective point objective, and then pull back. And so, nice clean turn. Chris is down another couple of models, 3 models, I think, relative to last turn. Oh, I have 1 order left, and the grenade launcher Moyib takes a grenade shot. Actually, I think it's McMurray, he's easier. The grenade launcher, so McMurray's grenade kills the last heal lot, or the second last heal lot over here. And even though we're on turn 2, Chris is he's really up shit creek here. He's got basically no orders left in this area. His main force is all the way over here, and my entire army has pulled back to this position here. And because of the deployment zone restrictions, I have just nothing to fear. I have nothing to fear about combat jump troopers, things that might appear from unexpected angles. I know with 100% certainty where everything in Chris's army can come from. And so even when he's like, okay, I'm going to have to think about, I might try and move, and he telegraphs the arrival of the parachutist, I'm like, well, that's fine, because the parachutist that turns up in this deployment zone is going to have fuck all orders, because everything in that deployment zone that's in that combat group is dead, and he acknowledges that. And so the wild parrot armed Echo Bravo is going to appear over here, and its main goal is going to be to just fight another turret, and then get this using a speedball to get this Montesa Knight unstuck. Patsy Garnett will also flip combat groups, and she's going to just come up and around here to try and just control some space, but there's very, very little that Chris has left. He is hoping to move models forward to be able to stage a Hail Mary last turn push, pretty much putting everything on the back of this Paramedic Montesa, and Paramedic Montesas are very, very good. But as we push into what in practice is going to be the final turn, I'm going to use Layla Sharif to Carbonite Patsy Garnett. I'm then going to kill Patsy Garnett with chain rifles from McMurrough, and then everything is just going to collapse back into a cordon surrounding the Asawira holding the research data, except the Boktar, who is going to push all the way forward and going to suppressive fire in the most annoying position. I think I might even get a kill on something during the course of this movement. Not enormously relevant, because as we click over into the next turn, we do a quick retreat check and we confirm that Chris is in retreat. And that wraps up this game of Ruby Monday Mission 3. Definitely a little bit of an exercise in taking someone's carefully built custom scenario and just absolutely breaking it in ways that they probably didn't expect. If you're playing this scenario yourself, then all of the advice that I put into practice here applies. Going first is very, very powerful, because power pack deployments are horrific to try and defend, more so in N5 than in any previous edition. There are loads of tools that are just grotesquely powerful at pushing into such constrained deployment conditions. You can use flyers, you can use spec fires, God help your opponent if you have access to tractor mule couriers. Even just punching a hacking network into your opponent's deployment zone and making it their problem can be enormously challenging. Secondly, first player is very good in this scenario because it gives you the first opportunity to smash and grab the objective from the research room and then leave your opponent for problems to deal with in the form of those turrets. Those turrets are an advantage to the first player if you can activate the research area, turn them all on, have them appear, and then get out without them bothering you. At bare minimum, forcing your opponent to lay all of the same amount of smoke that you did. On top of that, because of how the deployment zones are constrained. So firstly, there's the absolute exclusion zone where you just get to, as first player, always know where all of your opponent's stuff is, and as second player, target and destroy one of your opponent's flanks, and basically just because all of the orders that they would have to spend on that flank are in that flank, you get an enormous snowball advantage, which you can then use basically to springboard off for the remainder of the game because there will be a part of the table where your opponent is just quite weak. I do think there are ways that you can potentially defend against this, but one of the ways to defend against this is just to go first. Win the LT roll and go first. If you don't think that's an option, depending on what faction you're playing, then probably like hidden deployment camouflage, even something like an entire deployment zone is nothing but camouflage things, literally the purest form of null deployment. That might be how I would approach this as certain Ariadne factions, for example. Ultimately, I think the security room is potentially a little bit of a distraction. So even though Chris and I in this game both weighted kind of equally our two combat groups, if I was doing this again, I think there's a pretty reasonable chance that I would go pretty hard on the research center because that's where all of the points are. The game-winning number of points are the points for securing the research data. And in this game, we saw that I had to actually grab and then run away all the way across the other side of the table, which I was able to do using all of those tactical awareness orders. So I think a very successful execution of this scenario. Poor Chris absolutely on the receiving end of me having sat down and cooked about how to break a narrative. But he took it in good humor, as he always does. It's wonderful to play against him, wonderful to catch up. He does assure me that he had a good time. I certainly did. And so that puts us on a good footing going into what will be the final scenario coming out in a week, Ruby Monday Mission 4, which you should stay tuned for. Hope very much that you've enjoyed this. Quick channel plug, hit like, hit subscribe, comment down below. How would you approach this scenario? And as a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so either by becoming a channel member or through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below. As always, I hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.